Today we're going to be talking about single gene inheritance, looking at several different traits or types of traits in humans. We're going to begin by talking about modes of inheritance. A mode of inheritance is a particular set of rules that will explain patterns in how different inherited traits or inherited characteristics are passed through families. So we'll be basically looking at a couple different types or modes of inheritance and looking at the signs that that type of inheritance is occurring. We'll be looking at family patterns to determine the mode of inheritance. When we are looking at modes of inheritance, it can describe a couple of different things. First, a mode of inheritance would describe if a trait is on a gene that is on a autosome or a sex chromosome. Autosomes are chromosomes numbered 1 through 23. These are the regular chromosomes. Sex chromosomes, on the other hand, are chromosomes X and Y for a male or X and X for a female. These are also known as the 23rd pair of chromosomes. So traits are either found on the autosomes, chromosomes number 1 through 22, or on the sex chromosomes, chromosome pair number 23, or X and Y. We will spend a lot of time talking about sex chromosome linked traits in another chapter. Most of what we talk about in this chapter will then be genes that are located on autosomes. The second thing we can look at in terms of modes of inheritance then is whether a trait is dominant or recessive. So we will be looking at autosomal dominant and autosomal recessive traits in this chapter. First, let's start with autosomal dominant traits. Autosomal dominant traits are autosomal. That means they are carried on chromosomes number 1 through 22. So sex plays no role in the inheritance of these traits. So a sign for an autosomal dominant trait would that it appears equally in either sex. Another characteristic of an autosomal dominant trait would be that if a child has it, it must also be seen in at least one parent. In other words, autosomal dominant traits do not skip generations. If a child has it, at least one parent must also have it. This is the primary sign of an autosomal dominant trait. If one generation does not show it, then the transmission will stop. It will drop out of that family line altogether. It cannot show up again in a grandchild. That would be considered skipping a generation, and that would be a good sign that this is not an autosomal dominant trait. Autosomal dominant traits do not skip generations. Here's an example of a Punnett square. This is for a trait called distal symphalangism, which is referring to the bones in the fingers. You can see in the picture the x-ray shows how those bones are not normal. The Punnett square then would show us how that dominant trait is passed on. One of the parents has the trait, and they are big A, little a, and they then pass that trait on to half of their offspring. Another example of autosomal dominant traits would be Huntington disease, and your book does a great job describing that, so be sure to read all about Huntington disease on page 84 of your text. Again, autosomal dominant traits do not skip generations. That's the key sign of autosomal dominant. The other pattern of inheritance that we're going to look at in this chapter is autosomal recessive. Because they are autosomal, meaning they appear on chromosomes number 1 through 22, they are not related to sex at all. So autosomal recessive traits can appear equally in either sex. Because they are recessive, however, these traits can be hidden or masked. This means that a trait can skip a generation. This is a primary sign for autosomal recessive. Affected individuals need to have two parents that carry the recessive allele. Both parents must have at least one recessive allele in order for an offspring to end up with an autosomal recessive disorder. We can use Punnett squares to calculate probability of having a child with a trait if both parents are known carriers. Cystic fibrosis is a common autosomal recessive disorder in humans. And so you could look at a Punnett square for cystic fibrosis to determine what the likelihood would be of two carrier parents passing that on to their children. And this might be done when people are considering having children if they know that they have a history of an autosomal recessive disorder in their family. So in our Punnett square shown here, we have two parents that are both carriers. The father is big C, little c. He's normal, but he is carrying one recessive allele. The mother is big C, little c. She is normal, but she is carrying one recessive allele. If you look at their Punnett square, you would see that 3 out of the 4 children would be normal, and 1 out of the 4 children would be homozygous recessive for cystic fibrosis. So their children would have a 1 in 4 chance of having cystic fibrosis. Another characteristic that does come into play with autosomal recessive traits is the risk of higher incident of passing on the disease if the parents are blood relatives. This is called consanguinity, which basically translates as con meaning shared and sanguine referring to blood. So if they are blood relatives, meaning in the same family, there is a greater chance that they would be passing on a recessive trait because there's less diversity in the genes, and so a greater likelihood of passing on a recessive inherited disease. In many of the historical examples of recessive disorders, you would see examples of blood relatives marrying and having children. This would be especially true in like royal families in historic Europe. Here is a list of several dominant and recessive traits that are common in humans, so you can just kind of see how things line up as either dominant or recessive. And your book has more examples as well. Here is a chart showing some common recessive diseases that would be seen in humans. And so take a second to pause this video and read through some of these common recessive diseases. We'll be talking about a lot of these as we move forward. So again, pause and read through this. One last thing we're going to do in this video is to take a look at how you might solve a problem looking at dominant and recessive traits. And we're going to start here with a problem where we have two people, Wendy and Rick. And they're going to get married and they're going to have a child, and they're interested in what type of hair their child will have. So Wendy has curly hair. Wendy's dad is bald but had curly hair, and Wendy's mom had straight hair. We know that Wendy's husband Rick has straight hair. So what is the probability that Wendy and Rick's child will have straight hair? In this case, we're going to assume that curly is dominant. So our first step would be to list the different genotypes and phenotypes that are possible for this trait. We know that curly is dominant, so big C would be curly, and big C, little c would also be curly because it is dominant. This means that straight is the recessive trait, so straight hair would need to be little c, little c. The next thing we would want to do is determine the genotypes in our parental generation. So we know that Rick is little c because he has straight hair. That one is easy. Wendy is a little bit tougher. Wendy has curly hair, so she could be big C or big C, little c. So we need to look at Wendy's parents to determine Wendy's genotype. Turns out that Wendy is big C, little c. She has curly hair, but we know her mom had straight hair, so that little c comes from her mom. The next thing we would do is do a Punnett square, and you can go ahead and put this into your notes and fill this in. You're going to put the father's genes at the top, little c, and the mother's genes on the side, big C, little c. And then go ahead and fill in your Punnett square. And you can go ahead and pause the video and do that in your notes now. The next thing you're going to do is calculate the ratio for their offspring. It turns out that 2 of your boxes should be big C, little c, and 2 of your boxes should be little c. That would translate to 2 curly offspring and 2 straight hair offspring. So the answer to the question, what is the probability that Wendy and Rick's child will have straight hair? It would be 2 out of 4, or 1/2 chance that their child would have straight hair. So 2 out of 4 straight, or 50% straight hair. In your textbook, it does go a little bit into the difference between dominance and recessiveness, basically telling you that dominance doesn't necessarily mean a better trait, and recessiveness doesn't necessarily mean a weaker trait. And it goes on to explain how those things are related to different proteins. So make sure that you read about the meaning of dominance and recessiveness on page 85 of your book.